Hey guys, welcome back to MCReviews. It's Pete here to go back to doing that whole EP review thing that I like to do. I'm going to keep this intro short and simple. Today, I'm going to start the new review series, or it's not a new series, but the new series of episodes being on the Trick or Treat EP, which was from Halloween of 2012, which features 4 tracks. Welcome to the Zombie Disco by Rogue, which is the track I'll be reviewing today. The Man Who Laughs by Hellberg, Glimmer by Two Thirds featuring Coma, and Shank by Muzzy. So the one I'm going to be reviewing today, as I said before, is Welcome to the Zombie Disco, which is a dubstep track, which is something Rogue's done a bit of, but not an incredibly large amount. So let's just get into it and see what this one's like. The actual very start in the intro itself, I really like, because it begins with someone sounding very exhausted and scared, like they're running away, which is setting the scene that this person is running away from zombies. And you can hear in the background this very kind of electro-y, disco-y kind of thing going on in the background, which makes it feel like this person is outside the so-called zombie disco. But later, as the music becomes the actual focus and center stage after the scene is set, it's almost like this guy is going into the zombie disco, and the chaos that unfolds and all the music is what happens during his time there, which is really not something I've heard before. Like, of course, there's always setting the scene in music, but never really like that. But that's like, what, 20, 30 seconds? But after that, the background music does become the forefront. The intro section has a very funky, disco-y, more electro vibe compared to the drops. There are 4 main sounds of the intro, 2 of which are introduced before the beat comes in, those being a spooky background set of chords and a synthy counter melody. Once the beat comes in, which is a very nice breaksy kind of beat by the way, 2 more are introduced, which are backing bass and a little bell toll style of short melody. I like how the intro begins with the 2 middle sounds of everything that happens, and then the top and bottom layer are introduced later to give the section a more complete sound. It's a really good way to keep things changed up as it progresses, and not really in a way I've heard too much before. As this intro section goes on, it sounds like everything but the backing bass is fighting to be the main thing you focus on when you listen, and I really like that. Instead of focusing on making one melody here, Rogue went for a bunch of little melodies and chords that, though none of them are particularly long and in of themselves anything particularly forefront and center, they come together to really flesh out the whole intro. After doing this whole thing for a while, the build-up is very short, very quick, and not too much to say about it, and just goes right into the first drop. Now, I really like this first drop, and it's probably my favorite in the song, but something that I do have to admit, and does need to be said about all the drops of this song, is that there isn't anything much new or inventive about them at all. It's just dubstep doing its thing, but with a cool, spooky theme, and honestly, I'm totally okay with that. Not every song has to be unique and original or breaking boundaries in the genre. It's kind of okay for something to just be nothing new, but just something old done well, which is exactly what I think this song is, and this drop especially. So with that being said, let's talk about the drop itself. The main sounds that are constant are backing chords, which definitely hold up the spooky theme more than any other elements of the drop. And there's also this very whiny and repetitive synth that happens between a lot of the growly basses, which I shouldn't like because it's got a kind of air horny sound to it, but for some reason I really do. Everything else surrounding this are various growly basses that I won't take time to describe all of, but I will say they are a perfect level of heavy for me. They are nice and heavy, but aren't bro-step levels of being heavy. The kind that doesn't actually take the song sounding good into account and rather thinks the heavier the better. The beat here, to be fair, is a very standard halftime dubstep beat, as in it's on 1 and 3 of every beat, instead of being a bit more creative, but I can forgive it because the rest of the sound design makes up for it, and I never even noticed the beat was like that until I started reviewing the track. Also, halfway through the drop, it changes quite a bit, and some strings are added for one thing, which really adds to the dramatic and spooky atmosphere of the song. Also in this second half, the beat changes completely and becomes that much more complex and all over the place dubstep beat that I was talking about wasn't there before. The second half of this drop in general is just great and doesn't stop doing new things as the pace of it and a lot of the sounds change as well. Now, I know I've talked quite a bit about this first drop, so just to wrap this up for a bit of an overall, I love this first drop. I love the sound design, and even though it's not new or revolutionary, it matches the theme, and I love how this song is constantly changing up things to keep it from getting boring from the first half of the drop to the second. So even though it took me a while to talk about the intro on the first drop, everything from here on out will probably be much shorter, because everything, especially the midsections and ending, is mostly just rearranging of the intro and the first drop in terms of sound design. In fact, this midsection is identical to the end of the intro just before it builds up into the first drop, and is very short, so I'm already done talking about it. The second drop is structured exactly the same as the first, just with a few sound design changes to vary things up, but I don't know if it's quite enough, since we've heard this drop very recently, as there was only like a 20-30 second gap between the first and the second drop. And it really doesn't do anything massively new or different in between, as before. I did say the midsection is just kind of identical to the build-up of the first drop, but it's not bad enough to ruin the song for me, just a little gripe. Now, the second half of this drop, likes to do this thing that a few dubstep tracks from this era like to do, which is go even slower than dubstep already is, and slow everything down with it. And this can work if you've got top-notch sound design, but unfortunately in a track like this, where it's like, as I said, not breaking any boundaries, and the sound design isn't like absolute top-notch, slowing the sounds down in this just exposes them individually and makes you remember that this is a track from 2012. So as I'm sure you can tell, I'm really not a fan of the second half of the second drop. Then for a while it goes back to the second half of the first drop, but with little new stuff not worth mentioning, so more copy-paste kind of thing. Overall, the second drop is really meh, as the only two things it does that are new is like the second half, and the only other thing it does is use the same drop just with a couple of sound design changes, which really isn't enough to make it not feel like almost a copy paste. And even though the slowed down bit isn't, I just don't like the sound of that at all. The second midsection is barely even a thing. It's a slight modification of the intro, but it very quickly goes into the third drop. Luckily, the third drop is different and changes up things quite a bit. The main structure of the third drop is 3 quick dubsteppy growly basses, one after the other, and any other sort of synth or bass from the drops before fill in between. The 3 growl thing works really well, for one because the bass used for the growl is very cool, but mainly because in this drop there is a beat on all 3 growls which gives it drive and emphasis, which is what a big growly sound needs to have in order to sound as strong as it wants to be. Even in the not growl sections of this drop, the beat is all over the place, and it really keeps things interesting. And there is a second half to this drop where it becomes 2 growls, and the beat becomes more like the dubstep beats from before, and unfortunately it does do that same kind of slowed down effect from that second drop, but it kind of, instead of going from the normal drops to even slower than that, this is from like a faster drop to the normal drop, so it's not as bad, and it works way better, because the beat that slows down, it's not like it was in the second drop. Overall, this drop is a great climactic finisher, and is very luckily different to the other 2 drops. Not so much in sound design, except for the growls of course, but certainly in structure. Once again, the ending is much like the intro, just with music fading at the end as the zombie noises remain, and the zombies give one last call after the music is completely done, which is the last thing that happens, and the song is over. So overall, I think this song is great, but it definitely has room for improvement. To talk about the things I like, for the most part, I really like the contrast of the funky, disco-y, electro-sounding parts of the song, like the intro and the midsection, and the full-on dubstep drops, as that in itself is a good way to keep the song feeling varied and different as we constantly switch between one and the other. I really like the sound design pretty much all throughout the song as well, as it fits the theme and has much better basses than a lot of dubstep did in that era. The beat, while sometimes quite standard, is never especially boring, even in the more simplistic section, as it still fulfills its role, and when it does get more interesting and all over the place, it's awesome. And of course, I think you all know what my biggest problem with this song is going to be, the second drop. I honestly think the second drop was just unnecessary to have, and the song would have been overall better if it was just taken out. If it was more varied and didn't do the slowdown thing I mentioned earlier, it would be fine to have a second drop. But if you're going to have 3 drops in your song, you need to either make them all unique and interesting, or take the rocktronic route of putting a copy-paste drop as the first and third drops, but having something completely different for the middle second drop, so that you barely even notice the copy-paste section so much, because so much different stuff has happened in between. This song is so full on and pretty much goes straight from drop to drop, and while that isn't inherently a bad thing, if you don't give listeners time to cool down from what they heard, either with some more time between drops, or more varied drops in between, it just feels like you're listening to the same thing over and over again, which is the song's problem as it goes from the first drop to the second, as not only are the drops really similar, but it goes from one to the other way too quick. Without these problems, this song would probably be a very well-earned 8, as everything about this song is awesome. But unfortunately, everything I just said can't be ignored. But regardless, it does get a very solid 7 out of 10 for me, for being a very good track that could be improved. So guys, that was my review of Welcome to the Zombie Disco by Rogue, and thank you very much for watching, and please leave some comments below under the description section, because I really do like responding to all of them. I just don't feel like we get enough. But one thing I would like to mention while I've got you all listening is I recently made a Twitter page for MCReviews just to help, get people aware when new videos are out and stuff like that, because I know the YouTube sub boxes can be shitty. And I'd like to tag some of the artists that we review in their songs just so they might possibly see the video, because I think that's kind of what people like Aaron from the Synthesizer channel have done to get the artists to notice their things, because they got to be working some kind of magic, because I don't know how they do it. But so I'll leave there's a link to that on the channel, but I'll leave a link to that on in the description as well. So please feel free to go and check out our Twitter and follow us. That would be very nice. But anyway, that's all I've got to say. So thank you very much for watching the video. The next review will be of The Man Who Laughs by Hellberg, which, as much as Hellberg's done a lot of really bad stuff, especially in that era, I think you'll be surprised with what I have to say about it. So thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.